Okay, so this is part 3 of the little series I've been doing for you, Year 11, for the Civil Rights part of the course, talking about 1963 to 1965 and the protests and legislation that happened in that period. In the previous video, I talked about the year 1964 mainly and the Civil Rights Act, and how the Civil Rights Act, when it was passed in 1964, was kind of part 1 really of the significant gains, if you will, for African Americans in terms of civil rights legislation. It's the first kind of big piece of legislation in this period anyway that's a massive gain for them. But as we saw in that video, as I talked about in that video, they weren't completely happy or completely satisfied with the Civil Rights Act. Remember, it didn't bring an end to discrimination. They were still being discriminated against and abused, and there was not much that the Civil Rights Act could do about that. In terms of everyday discrimination, anyway, certainly in terms of employment and things like that, it said that was illegal, but it couldn't do much about everyday discrimination. Remember that a lot of these laws were hard to enforce. So the Civil Rights Act, although it was a good thing for African Americans, largely they weren't completely satisfied with it. There were still some areas that it fell short in. And one of those areas was voting rights. And in fact, that's what I'm going to talk about in this video. I'm going to talk about two things that are interlinked, that both happened in 1965, and that's the Selma March and the Voting Rights Act. So going back to voting rights, African Americans felt there wasn't really enough being done about voter registration. Remember that African Americans had a really hard time in the South, in particular, registering to vote. And the Civil Rights Act hadn't really done an awful lot in that area for them. For instance, the voter registration tests still existed, and as we know, they were quite harsh on African Americans. A lot of African Americans who had a fairly poor quality of education compared to white Americans found it very hard to pass these registration tests, and they still existed even after the Civil Rights Act. So that was a problem for them. They were meant to be the same for both black and white people, but again, as I say, the white Americans, had generally had a better quality of education, so they were more likely to pass these voter registration tests than many African Americans. So the campaigning basically for voting rights continued, and it continued with, as I say, or I've said, the Selma March of 1965. Now, Selma is a city in Alabama, and Alabama had a really poor percentage of African American voters, or African Americans who were registered to vote. Had a very poor percentage of it, and therefore it made sense for Martin Luther King and for the SCLC. Remember, that's the Southern Christian Leadership Council. It made sense for those people in those groups, that group, to protest there, because you protest where the problem that you're protesting about is quite evident. And as I say, Alabama had a very poor, or Dallas County I should say, where Selma is, had a very, very poor percentage of African Americans who were registered to vote. So the protests took place there at first, and between January and March of 1965, it was protests out in the street and campaigns for African Americans to register to vote, and it actually led to many violent clashes between the police and the protesters, really violent clashes. In fact, one protester was killed in these protests. So you can see there was a lot of violence in these protests between January and March in 1965. So in the end, it's decided that they're going to change tactics because they're not getting anywhere. There are these violent protests where people are being killed and severely injured. So the tactics change, and on Sunday, the 7th of March 1965, a march takes place, or I should say a march is planned to go from Selma to the state capital of Alabama, which is Montgomery, which we've heard about before, obviously with the Montgomery bus boycott. So that's the plan. They're going to march, these protesters are going to march from Selma in Alabama to Montgomery in Alabama to again raise awareness to the issue. That's the aim. Now, just outside, so the march began on the 7th of March, as I say, 1965. Now, just outside of Selma, at a bridge called the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the protesters were met, or the marchers, I should say, were met by police, and they were subjected to some really violent attacks involving tear gas and horses and clubs and cattle prods, electric cattle prods. It was so violent that this event became known as Bloody Sunday. It took place on a Sunday. It became known as Bloody Sunday because it was so violent. Now, much like incidents such as the Birmingham protest, the footage of this was filmed. The footage of this is beamed around the world, and again, people are shocked and horrified by the things that they are seeing, including Lyndon Johnson, the president. And Lyndon Johnson actually used the violence of Selma, or that had taken place on this march, to push through the voting rights bill. Okay, so he wants to do more for African Americans, particularly in terms of voting rights. So he puts the voting rights bill through, or presents it, I should say, to Congress. Okay, it was submitted to Congress on the 17th of March, 1965. So 10 days after this violent march in Selma. He also took control of the Alabama National Guard. Remember, they are armed, and he gets them to protect basically the marchers because they want to do this again, or they plan on doing this again. So he takes control of the Alabama National Guard, and they protect the marchers. And the march takes place again on the 21st of March, and this time with the protection of the National Guard, they're able to make it all the way from Selma to Montgomery. It took them 4 days to march because it's quite a long distance. So on the 25th of March, the marchers made it to Montgomery, Alabama, and as I say, completed the march. There were around 250,000 marchers who took place. Now, the voting rights, as I say, the voting rights bill had been presented to Congress by Lyndon Johnson, and it was turned into a law, or the Voting Rights Act, I should say, on the 6th of August 1965. So this is the second part of, or the second significant piece of civil rights legislation that comes into being in this period of 63 to 65 that I've been talking about. Second major piece of legislation, but the thing that you really need to focus on is why was it so significant or so important? Well, let's start with what it did. Now, it did three things really for African Americans. It set up, first of all, one fair national test for voting registration for everyone. Okay, it's the same for everyone, which is a big plus here. It's a fair national test. States can't make up their own. Well, in fact, I'm going to go on to that now. It banned states from setting up their own voting qualifications unless they were approved by the federal government or the national government. So again, the national government, the federal government, are kind of stepping in to stop these southern states coming up with unfair voting registration tests, because African Americans are really struggling to pass these tests. So the federal government are stamping down on it and saying enough. No, it has to be fair, it has to be the same for everybody. It also, the Voting Rights Act, put in place federal examiners, so basically people to check and supervise. Federal examiners were appointed to supervise voter registration across America. Okay, so these people are, as I say, supervising, making sure that people are, or African Americans in particular, are being able to register to vote fairly and properly, and they're not being stopped or any kind of obstacles being put in their way. So all of this led to a dramatic increase in African Americans registering to vote. In fact, I've got some figures for you here. So in Alabama, for example, in 1964, as you can see there were 19.3 or 19.3% of African Americans in Alabama were registered to vote, I should say. By 1968, it was 61.3%. So again, a big jump up there. It's similar in Georgia. Let's get the bit of paper right. There we go. In Georgia, so 1964, as you can see there, 27.4% of eligible African Americans were registered to vote then. By 1968, it gone up to 60.4%. Another big jump in Louisiana, where you've got 31.6% in 1964, almost doubled to 1968, where you got 60.8%. And finally, the biggest jump, massive jump here, in Mississippi. Look at that, in 1964, you've got 6.7% of African Americans who should be able to vote or are eligible to vote being registered. Look at 1968, 67.2%, or 0.5%, sorry, I'm reading it back to front. So massive jumps, and this all comes about, or largely comes about, because of the Voting Rights Act, because it's suddenly so much easier for African Americans to register to vote. So the numbers, as you've seen there, jump up by 30, 40, in some cases like 60%, massive jumps. But going back to the question that I raised before, why was this so significant? Why was this so important? Well, it's really significant for African Americans because the Voting Rights Act meant that now African Americans could basically vote in people who were going to support them. So politicians who wanted to help African Americans suddenly have got a much better chance of getting voted in, because you would imagine that most, if not all, African Americans will vote for them. Beforehand, you would get some white Americans voting for them, but a lot of white Americans, particularly in the southern states, are going to go, I'm not going to vote for them because they want to help the African Americans. Now that the African Americans are able to vote in such large numbers, they're able to, in many cases, get in politicians or vote in politicians who are going to help them, which is good news for them. And kind of linked to that, but on the flip side, if you will, politicians now, so politicians who maybe in the past hadn't promoted African American matters, if for want of a better word, politicians who hadn't really cared or shown that they cared about African Americans in the past, suddenly are now. A lot of politicians think, oh dear, beforehand I didn't really need to worry about the African American vote because it was so small. I didn't need to really pander to them or do anything to please them, because it was only 5% of the vote or what have you, or maybe even less. I didn't need to worry about them. Now I do. Now when I'm campaigning to be elected to Congress or the Senate or maybe even President, I need to now actually really think about what African Americans want as well as white Americans. So it gives the African Americans so much more power when they're going to the booth to vote, because beforehand there's been so few of them, or so little of them being able to vote, that they haven't really been able to make a difference. Now they can, because as you've seen, so many of them now are able to and are voting, which is great for them. So it really does, the Voting Rights Act makes a big difference to them, and it's a really key piece of legislation and something that you need to know about for the exam. So I hope that this video and the previous two have helped you understand the events of 1963 through to 65 in terms of the protests that take place, but also the legislation, namely the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. So hopefully you understand that a little bit better now, and that it's helping you towards your revision for the mocks that are coming up. So make sure that you are revising for those mocks. Obviously there's loads of videos already on the channel that you can be looking back on for civil rights, for Germany and for World War I, because they're going to be the three topics on your mock test. I will be uploading some more videos over the next couple of weeks to help you with your revision, but I hope, as I say, this has been helpful, and I'll see you very soon.